Welcome back to Invisible History, the channel where we unearth the hidden truths and untold stories that shaped our world. Today, we're stepping into a realm shrouded in ritual, secrecy, and divine mystique, the election of the Roman Pontiff. For centuries, the image of white smoke curling from the Sistine Chapel chimney has symbolized a momentous event. The selection of a new pope, the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics, a choice supposedly guided by divine inspiration. But what if I told you that behind this sacred facade, the process of choosing God's representative on earth was, for much of history, anything but divine? What if it was often a brutal, cutthroat battleground of ambition, corruption, blackmail, and even outright violence? For centuries, the papacy was not merely a spiritual office. It was a potent temporal power, controlling vast lands, armies, and immense wealth. To control the pope was to control a significant piece of the global chessboard, influencing everything from royal marriages to declarations of war, from the anointing of emperors to the excommunication of kings. This immense power naturally attracted men of immense ambition, transforming the election process into a high-stakes political game where the rules were often bent, broken, or simply ignored. Before the formal institution of the conclave as we know it, papal elections were chaotic affairs. Popes were often chosen by acclamation of the Roman clergy and people, a method that quickly devolved into mob rule, riots, and violent clashes between aristocratic families vying for control. The city of Rome itself would often descend into chaos, streets barricaded, rival factions literally battling to install their preferred candidate. This messy, often deadly free-for-all led to short reigns, multiple rival popes, and a profound crisis of legitimacy for the entire church. The very idea of a holy selection was being utterly desecrated by human greed, political machination, and outright savagery. The church desperately needed a solution, something to impose order and, crucially, to safeguard the sacredness of the process from the corrupting influence of earthly power. This desperate need for reform eventually gave birth to the conclave itself. The word conclave comes from the Latin cum clave, meaning with a key or locked with a key. Its origins are rooted in a particularly dramatic and scandalous election that dragged on for almost 3 years in Viterbo, Italy, from 1268 to 1271. The cardinals, locked in endless bickering and factionalism, simply could not agree on a new pope. They were divided along national lines, family loyalties, and theological disputes, each faction refusing to concede to the other. The city of Viterbo, suffering from this prolonged vacancy, finally took matters into its own hands in an act of exasperation. The exasperated citizens locked the cardinals in the papal palace, removed the roof to expose them to the elements, allowing rain, sun, and cold to beat down on them, and progressively restricted their food to just bread and water, hoping to literally starve them into a decision. This harsh measure, a stark reminder of the populace's frustration, eventually worked, leading to the election of Pope Gregory VI. He, having experienced the ordeal firsthand and understanding the urgent need for a more orderly process, then formalized the rules for future elections. The idea was simple and radical. Isolate the cardinals completely from outside influence, forcing them to rely only on divine guidance and their own conscience. No letters, no messengers, no worldly distractions, no lavish meals, no comfortable beds. Just prayer, deliberation, and the mounting discomfort until a pope was chosen. It was a brilliant concept on paper, designed to root out the very corruption that plagued earlier elections. The intention was to create a pure, unblemished spiritual environment where the Holy Spirit could truly guide the votes. But human ingenuity especially when fueled by ambition and power, is remarkably adept at finding loopholes, even within the most sacred and sealed environments. Almost immediately after its institution, despite the sealed doors and the promise of divine guidance, the spirit of the conclave was repeatedly violated. The first, and perhaps most pervasive, corruption to seep into the process was simony. This wasn't just small-time bribery. It was the systematic buying and selling of votes, often involving vast sums of money, lavish benefices, lucrative church positions with guaranteed income, prestigious church offices, lucrative land grants, and even explicit promises of future cardinalates or papal appointments for family members. Candidates would promise entire palaces, rich bishoprics, or even the direct control of entire towns and their accompanying revenues to secure a cardinal's vote. It transformed the spiritual election into a literal marketplace of souls, where the highest bidder often claimed the chair of St. Peter. The era of powerful Roman noble families, like the Orsini, the Colonna, and later the Borgia, also ensured that even the most stringent rules struggled to contain their influence. These families treated the papacy as a personal prize, a means to consolidate their staggering power and wealth, often through military might and strategic marriages. Their cardinals would enter the conclave not as independent spiritual electors, but as loyal agents of their family's political and economic interests. They would caucus in secret, strategize elaborate plots, and sometimes even physically intimidate rival factions or individual cardinals to ensure their chosen candidate, or at least one not hostile to their family's agenda, emerged victorious. Even if the cardinals were physically locked away, the long-standing feuds and alliances, the debts owed, and the promises made carried over into the sealed chambers. The conclave, intended as a sanctuary of piety, frequently became a hotbed of intrigue, a hidden battleground where the destiny of the Church and indeed of much of Europe was decided not by divine will, but by human avarice, cunning, and raw power. The very air inside those hallowed halls could be thick with unspoken threats, calculated betrayals, and the suffocating pressure of monumental ambition. Cardinals would emerge from these conclaves physically and emotionally drained, often having endured weeks of intense psychological warfare and moral compromise. But the corruption wasn't confined to the inner circle of the cardinals themselves. As the papacy grew in temporal power, its influence extended far beyond Rome, making it a critical pawn in the larger game of European politics. Kings, emperors, and powerful princes across the continent began to exert immense pressure on the conclave, often through their own cardinal representatives, but also through direct threats, diplomatic blackmail, and even military intervention. This external interference, cloaked in diplomatic niceties but underpinned by the undeniable force of armies, became another insidious layer of dirt on the white smoke, proving almost impossible to wash away for centuries. One of the most powerful and persistent tools in their arsenal was the jus exclusivae, or the right of exclusion. This was the supposed right of certain Catholic monarchs, notably the Holy Roman Emperor, later Austria, France, and Spain, to formally veto the election of a candidate they found unacceptable. This right, though never formally recognized by the Church in canonical law, was exercised repeatedly throughout history, often paralyzing conclaves for weeks or even months. Imagine the dramatic scene. A cardinal might be on the very verge of achieving the two-thirds majority required for election, the votes tallied, anticipation palpable, only for a messenger, perhaps a hastily dispatched ambassador or a cardinal acting on behalf of a sovereign, to arrive with an official declaration announcing a veto from a distant monarch. This shocking intervention would immediately nullify the votes, force the cardinals back to the drawing board, their progress undone, and the entire process thrown into disarray. This wasn't just political maneuvering. It was a blatant assertion of secular power over the spiritual realm, turning the conclave into a battleground for European hegemony. with the cardinals often caught as unwitting pawns between rival royal houses and their often conflicting agendas. The sheer frustration of being so close, only to be stopped by an external force, was immense. The psychological warfare within those sealed walls was immense. Cardinals, already exhausted by weeks of confinement, often poor food, and relentless, secretive debate, would face intense pressure from their national factions. Loyalty to their order, their country, or their personal ambition often clashed fiercely with their spiritual duty to elect the best candidate for the Church. Despite the strict rules of isolation, secret messages found their ways in and out, sometimes through disguised servants who exploited lax security, hidden compartments within food or furniture, or even coded notes written in invisible ink or baked into loaves of bread. The ingenuity of those trying to circumvent the rules was often as great as the rules themselves. The stakes were impossibly high. The future of the Church, the balance of power in Europe, and for the cardinals themselves, immense personal gain or complete ruin. The very air inside the Sistine Chapel could be thick with suspicion, whispered promises, and the unspoken threat of what would happen if a cardinal voted the wrong way, incurring the wrath of a powerful monarch or a vengeful cardinal faction. They were locked in, but the world's ambitions still found a way to seep through the cracks. During times of deep schism, the situation became even more chaotic, pushing the papacy to the brink of collapse. The Great Schism of the West, 1378-1417, for instance, saw the unprecedented spectacle of two, and at one point even three, popes reigning simultaneously, each elected by different factions of cardinals, often under duress or through highly questionable means. These anti-popes were not just theological curiosities. They were powerful instruments of political power, supported by different European nations, leading to decades of spiritual confusion and outright political turmoil that nearly tore the Church apart. Europe was divided, kingdoms pledged allegiance to different pontiffs, and the very fabric of Catholic unity seemed irrevocably torn. Each election during these periods was a stark testament to how external forces could completely subvert the intended divine process, twisting the selection of a spiritual leader into a mere extension of geopolitical maneuvering, leaving millions of faithful wondering who the true Pope actually was and whether the institution itself could ever recover its sanctity. Perhaps the most infamous, and certainly one of the most well-documented examples of a conclave utterly dominated by corruption and unbridled ambition, is that of 1492, which saw the election of Rodrigo Borgia as Pope Alexander VI. This was the height of the Renaissance papacy, a period when popes often acted more like secular princes than spiritual shepherds, deeply entangled in the intricate political and military affairs of the Italian peninsula. Rome was a vibrant, yet dangerous hotbed of power, art, immense wealth and ruthless competition, and the papacy was seen as the ultimate prize for ambitious noble families, a stepping stone to unparalleled worldly influence. The moral authority of the Church was often overshadowed by its temporal power. Rodrigo Borgia, already a powerful cardinal with vast personal wealth, numerous benefices, and a scandalous reputation for openly maintaining mistresses and having several children, a surprisingly common open secret for some high-ranking clergy of the era, entered the conclave of 1492, determined to win. He was pitted against equally ambitious and powerful rivals, notably Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, representing the powerful Milanese family, and Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, a fierce and uncompromising rival who would later become Pope Julius II. The conclave dragged on for weeks, with intense negotiations, backroom deals, and seemingly endless gridlock, as the major factions were too evenly matched to secure the necessary two-thirds majority. The air inside the Sistine Chapel was thick with frustration and mounting pressure. It was then that Borgia launched his systematic campaign of explicit bribery, a chilling and almost audacious display of simony that remains one of the most well-documented instances in papal history. He didn't just offer vague promises or subtle hints. He dispensed immense wealth and specific, tangible benefits with audacious transparency. To Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, a crucial swing voter and a powerful figure, he promised the hugely lucrative office of Vice-Chancellor of the Church, the magnificent Borgia family palace in Rome, and a staggering 4 fully loaded mules carrying silver, a literal treasure train. Other cardinals received vast sums of money, prestigious bishoprics, complete with their associated incomes and power, rich abbeys, and even the direct control of entire towns and their accompanying revenues. For instance, Cardinal Orsini was promised Borgia's own palace, an array of fortified castles, and the Abbey of Subiaco, while Cardinal Colonna received the Abbey of Subiaco's revenues for his lifetime. Cardinal Raffaele Riario, another key vote, was promised 4 mules laden with silver plate. These were not subtle hints or veiled suggestions. These were direct, undeniable, and often publicly known transactions of immense power and wealth in exchange for a sacred vote. The price for the papacy was laid bare for all to see. The sheer scale and openness of Borgia's bribery shocked even his contemporaries, who, while accustomed to a certain level of political maneuvering and favoritism, had rarely seen such blatant and widespread disregard for the spiritual integrity of the election. His immense wealth, his cunning strategies, and the blatant promises of future favors proved utterly irresistible to enough cardinals. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope, taking the name Alexander VI. His election, widely seen and openly criticized as a clear result of financial corruption, immediately tainted his papacy in the eyes of many. It fueled intense criticism and contributed significantly to the growing calls for radical reform that would eventually explode into the Protestant Reformation just decades later. The white smoke that rose from the Sistine Chapel that day was, for many, not a symbol of divine inspiration, but a clear, damning sign of the darkest human desires at play, leaving a deep and lasting stain on the sacred process that would take centuries to partially erase. The consequences of such dirty elections were profound and far-reaching, reverberating throughout the Church and across the entire continent. They not only undermined the moral authority of the papacy, making it a target of satire, scorn, and revolutionary zeal, but often plunged the Church into decades of schism, violent political turmoil, and widespread spiritual confusion among the faithful. When the very head of the Church was seen as having bought his way to power, or having been installed by foreign monarchs, it created a fundamental crisis of faith that reverberated across Europe, fueling movements for radical change and challenging the very foundations of the Church's legitimacy. The outright scandals, the spectacle of multiple popes vying for power, and the blatant simony were key factors that contributed directly to the fracturing of Christendom during the Reformation, demonstrating that the Church's internal flaws and human corruption could be as destructive as any external enemy. It became agonizingly clear that the Church's very survival and its ability to maintain its spiritual and moral authority depended entirely on finding a way to ensure the purity and integrity of its most fundamental process. The struggle to reform the conclave was a long and arduous one, stretching across centuries of evolving rules, papal decrees, and increasing vigilance. Early attempts at reform were often met with stubborn resistance from those who directly benefited from the corruption, or from powerful secular rulers who wished to maintain their influence over the Holy See. However, driven by repeated crises, the immense spiritual damage, and the urgent need to restore legitimacy, successive popes and church councils gradually tightened the screws. Rules were introduced to explicitly forbid simony, with severe penalties, including automatic excommunication for those who engaged in it, aiming to make the cost of bribery too high. The isolation of the cardinals became progressively stricter, culminating in the complete sealing of the Sistine Chapel and the absolute prohibition of all outside communication. Even the notorious gossip and secret notes that once flowed freely into the conclave were systematically eliminated, with modern technology now creating an impenetrable barrier. Even the jus exclusivae, the perceived right of veto held by certain Catholic monarchs, finally met its definitive end. Though it persisted, causing trouble and delaying conclaves well into the 19th century, the last time it was actually exercised was in 1903 by Austria, against Cardinal Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro. It was definitively abolished by Pope Pius X in 1904. He declared that any cardinal attempting to exercise such a veto would incur automatic excommunication, marking a crucial and final step in definitively freeing the conclave from overt secular political control. The very practices that made these historical conclaves so dirty, the blatant bribes, the overt threats, the unbridled political interference, were systematically, though slowly and painstakingly, dismantled piece by piece. The painful lessons of history ultimately forged a stronger, purer process. Today, the conclave is a vastly different process. While human elements of personality, theological viewpoints, and even subtle factionalism or lobbying among cardinals can never be entirely removed from any human institution, the explicit bribery, overt political blackmail, and direct outside interference that characterized past elections have largely been eliminated. The secrecy is profound, the rules are meticulously enforced, and the cardinals are genuinely isolated, forced to deliberate in a spiritual space. The white smoke that now rises from the Sistine Chapel truly symbolizes a choice made within the sacred confines of the Vatican, largely free from the crude machinations of worldly power that once plagued it. And that, my friends, is the invisible history behind the conclave's evolution. The modern purity and solemnity of the papal election process is not a given. It's a hard-won victory, a direct consequence of centuries of human failings, intense political intrigue, and the Church's relentless struggle to overcome its own historical dirt. And it's a powerful reminder that even the most revered institutions have hidden pasts, filled with unexpected dramas, and that true progress often emerges directly from the very flaws they strive to overcome, leading to an unexpected strength and resilience that few would have predicted. If this deep dive into the hidden world of papal elections fascinated you, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribing to Invisible History means you'll never miss another untold story like this one. And tell us in the comments below, what other historical secrets do you want us to unearth? We're always listening.